If you sign that structure, sir, you won't own the fund by Friday. The words landed in the boardroom like a crack through glass. 12 executives turned at once, some with irritation, others with disbelief, all of them staring at the woman who had spoken from the far end of the polished walnut table. Naomi Carter stood near the projection screen, one hand resting lightly against a stack of briefing folders, her navy blouse plain against a room full of tailored European suits. She had been invited as a contract analyst, temporary staff, invisible support. No one expected her to interrupt Richard Whitmore. Especially not in the final seconds before a $9 billion sovereign infrastructure deal was set to close. Whitmore leaned back slowly in his leather chair, silver cuff links flashing beneath recessed lights. His smile came first, thin and almost amused. Then the room heard it, the soft chuckle of a man accustomed to humiliating people without raising his voice. And what exactly, he asked, drawing out every word, would someone with community college economics know about sovereign reserve architecture? A few around the table laughed too quickly. Someone lowered their eyes. Someone else reached for a pen just to avoid looking at Naomi. But she didn't move. Through the 40-foot windows behind Whitmore, lower Manhattan shimmered in late afternoon gold, the Hudson reflecting light like molten copper. Naomi's pulse thudded in her ears, but her voice stayed calm. The liquidity covenant in Section 8 transfers stabilization obligations after a debt shock. If commodity yields slip 2 points, your collateral waterfall reverses. Silence. Even the HVAC hum seemed to fade. Whitmore's fingers paused over the signature page. His smile hardened. Remarkable, he said. We bring in a temp analyst and suddenly we have a central banker. The line drew restrained laughter, but weaker this time. Naomi had seen rooms like this before, though none of them knew it. Rooms where fortunes tilted on a single phrase buried in legal language. Rooms where men mistook confidence for competence. She glanced at the screen where debt ratios glowed in blue columns. One figure was wrong. Deliberately wrong. She had seen the trap an hour earlier and had tried to stay silent. But silence had a cost she knew too well. Whitmore rose and walked toward the display, 6'2" of old money authority, each polished shoe stepped soft against imported carpet. He stopped just short of her, close enough for the others to feel the imbalance. You're telling me, he said, voice low enough to cut, that I missed something in a structure reviewed by 3 law firms, 2 treasury advisors, and my own risk desk. Naomi met his eyes. I'm saying they missed what someone wanted hidden. A murmur moved across the room like a current. One board member pulled the contract closer. Another began flipping pages. Whitmore noticed. His jaw tightened. Education can make people overconfident, Ms. Carter. Especially unfinished education. That hit the room with a colder force than the mockery before it. Naomi felt the old sting of being reduced to paper credentials, of brilliance measured against pedigree. Yet she only looked toward page 84 and said, almost gently, check the reserve trigger footnote. For a long second no one breathed. Then one director adjusted his glasses and began reading. Another leaned in. Whitmore turned back toward the table, expression unreadable now. Outside, sunlight slipped lower, throwing bars of gold across the glass and over Naomi's face. In that light she looked less like a temp employee than something the room had failed to recognize. Whitmore picked up the contract again, but his hand no longer moved toward the signature line. It hovered. And in the stillness, beneath the cold architecture of power, the first fracture appeared. Richard Whitmore did not sit back down right away. He remained standing beside the table, thumb pressed against the edge of the contract, eyes narrowed toward the footnote Naomi had named as if the paper itself had changed weight in his hands. Across from him, Martin Ellison, senior counsel with 30 years in sovereign finance, adjusted his reading glasses and leaned over page 84. The room that had once felt carved from certainty now held something more fragile, a tension thin as wire. Naomi stood still, but inside her memory moved elsewhere, far from Manhattan glass and billion-dollar signatures. It moved back to a narrow apartment in Baltimore where her father once spread newspaper business pages across a kitchen table with one broken chair. He used to tell her markets were not numbers but stories of who got protected and who got sacrificed. She had believed him long before she ever entered a ministry briefing room overseas. "There is a contingent reserve sweep," Ellison finally said, voice tighter than before. Heads lifted. Another director reached for the annexes. Someone whispered, "How did we miss that?" Whitmore did not answer. He only looked at Naomi with a new stillness, not respect yet, but caution. "Who trained you to spot sovereign rollover traps?" he asked. It sounded almost casual, but the room heard the strain under it. Naomi folded her hands. "I learned where fragile systems break." It was true, though not the whole truth. She would not hand this room her history because it demanded explanation. She had spent too many years watching power ask for credentials only after being challenged. Outside the windows, the sun dipped lower, casting amber lines across the conference table. The brass clock near the credenza ticked loud enough to notice now. Whitmore returned slowly to his chair. No one laughed anymore. A junior analyst who had dismissed Naomi 2 hours earlier now stared as though trying to place a face from some half-remembered article. But Naomi knew how rooms shifted after authority trembled. Curiosity could become admiration, or threat. Both were dangerous. Whitmore turned another page, then stopped. "If the trigger activates," he said, speaking more to himself than the room, "the stabilization pool absorbs default exposure." Ellison nodded once. "And the fund becomes guarantor of losses." A silence followed that felt colder than panic. Naomi noticed Whitmore's pen lying untouched near the signature line. Earlier it had looked inevitable. Now it looked abandoned. She remembered another pen once hovering over another agreement years ago in a sovereign treasury office half a world away, when ministers had argued over food. Imports and currency collapse while rain battered the windows. She had been younger then, but not unseen. Or not entirely. Those years seemed buried now beneath ordinary titles and temporary contracts. Yet some instincts did not retire. Whitmore looked up again. "Why are you doing contract review work?" he asked. There was suspicion in it, but something else too, something almost unsettled. Naomi gave a small breath. "Sometimes the world stops hiring what it does not know how to place." One board member looked down at that. Another shifted in discomfort. It was too honest for a room built on controlled language. Whitmore's expression hardened, though less from arrogance now than resistance to what he was beginning to suspect. Then his chief of staff entered quietly, leaned to his ear, and whispered something. Whitmore's eyes flickered, surprised for the first time. He looked back at Naomi as if a second equation had appeared in front of him. "Miss Carter," he said, slower now, "have we met before?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She only glanced at the city glowing beyond the glass, where evening was gathering over the river in sheets of copper light. Then she said, "Not in a room where I was meant to speak." And something in Whitmore's face, almost imperceptible, began to change. The question lingered after Naomi spoke, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they exposed. "Not in a room where I was meant to speak." It settled over polished wood and crystal water glasses like a truth no one had prepared to hear. Richard Whitmore held her gaze a moment too long, then looked away first. For a man whose advantage had always been control, even that small surrender carried weight. His chief of staff stepped back from the chair, uneasy now, as Martin Ellison turned more pages with increasing urgency. Paper whispered. Pens tapped. The confidence that had opened the meeting was thinning into something more brittle. Then Ellison stopped at an appendix buried near the end of the package. "There is an offshore reserve custodian not disclosed in the executive summary," he said. That was not in the briefing deck. Another board member muttered a curse. Under his breath. Whitmore extended his hand. "Give me that." His tone had sharpened, but the mockery was gone. Naomi watched him scan the annexes, jaw set tighter with each line. She had seen that expression before in ministers who realized too late they had been maneuvered. It was the face of pride meeting arithmetic. Outside, dusk pressed deeper against the windows, and the city lights began waking one floor at a time. In the reflection, Naomi saw herself layered over Manhattan, as though memory and present had merged into one pane of glass. Years ago she had stood in a sovereign stabilization office in Lagos at nearly midnight, reviewing reserve flight scenarios under fluorescent lights while a finance minister paced barefoot over marble floors. Coffee gone cold. Rain pounding shutters. Markets opening in Tokyo in less than 6 hours. She had been 29 and responsible for preventing a currency spiral that could have erased pensions for millions. She had not thought of that room in years. Yet standing here, hearing men debate risks she had once carried on her shoulders, it returned with painful clarity. Whitmore lowered the papers slowly. "Who drafted this structure?" he asked. No one answered at first. Then a vice chairman named Howard Finch cleared his throat. Voss Capital originated the terms. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "And none of you caught this?" No one spoke. The room's silence had shifted from dismissive to exposed. Naomi knew what came next in places like this. Power, once embarrassed, often looked for someone to blame. She had lived through enough institutions to recognize the weather before it broke. She gathered her folders quietly. "If my role here is complete," she said, "I can leave you to deliberate." Whitmore looked up sharply. "Sit down." It was not a command barked from superiority now. It carried urgency. Even surprise at his own tone. Naomi hesitated but remained standing. She had no interest in becoming convenient once proven useful. Whitmore studied her with a harder concentration than before. "You said systems break where protection fails." He paused. "That is not something taught in graduate seminars." Naomi gave no answer. Instead she looked toward the reserve models still glowing on the screen. A red line drifted downward through projected commodity prices. She knew if the model ran another 6 months forward, the entire financing collapsed. One junior associate, pale now, began typing rapidly into a laptop. Numbers updated. Then he froze. "Sir," he said softly, almost afraid of the sound of his own voice, "if Ms. Carter is right, the sovereign fund would absorb $28 billion in contingent liabilities." A pulse of disbelief moved through the room. Whitmore leaned back, and for the first time all day he looked older. Not weakened. Just suddenly aware of consequence. Then his chief of staff, still standing near the door, spoke carefully. "Sir. I found something." He slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was an old conference photograph from Geneva nearly a decade earlier. Ministers. Central bankers. Security officials. And at the center, younger, composed, unmistakable, stood Naomi Carter. Whitmore stared. His hand went still on the leather armrest. The room did not breathe. And Naomi, seeing recognition dawn too quickly now to stop, knew the hidden name in the archive had just begun to rise. The photograph on the tablet seemed to alter the air itself. No one reached for water. No one touched a keyboard. Richard Whitmore stared at the younger Naomi standing in the Geneva summit image beneath the crest of an international monetary forum, her posture composed, one hand resting over briefing notes while heads of state leaned in her direction. The timestamp in the corner read 2014. For a long moment Whitmore said nothing. Then almost under his breath, as if speaking to himself, he murmured, "The Lagos Stabilization Accord." Martin Ellison looked up sharply. "You know it?" Whitmore did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the image. Every sovereign desk on Wall Street studied it. The words fell into the room with the force of revelation. Naomi said nothing. She had not intended to be found through archives and forgotten summit photographs. She had intended only to stop a disastrous signature. But recognition had its own momentum. One board member leaned forward as though seeing her for the first time. Another whispered, "She ran the Reserve Defense Committee." Not a question. A realization. Whitmore set the tablet down with unusual care, as though rough movement might disturb whatever understanding was forming. The city beyond the glass had turned blue-black now, office towers glowing like constellations. Reflections moved across the walnut table in long strips of silver. "Why," Whitmore asked slowly, "is someone who once managed sovereign reserves sitting in this room as a contract temp?" It was the same question from earlier, but stripped of condescension. It carried something rarer. Genuine incomprehension. Naomi folded the edge of one briefing folder, considering how much truth power ever deserved. "Because institutions remember risk when it saves them," she said quietly, "but not always who carried it." The sentence landed harder than accusation. No one challenged it. Whitmore leaned back, studying her with an intensity now absent of mockery. Yet Naomi sensed something else rising under the shift in respect. Resistance. Men who built identities on being the most informed in every room did not surrender hierarchy easily. And there it was. Whitmore's expression cooled. "If you knew this structure was compromised," he said, "why wait until the signature page to intervene?" The room tensed again. A test. Not gratitude. Trial. Naomi had expected it. "Because your team dismissed the preliminary risk memo I submitted at noon." Silence. A junior associate nearly dropped his pen. Whitmore turned toward his chief of staff. "There was a memo?" The man swallowed. "It was routed through compliance and flagged as non-material." Whitmore's jaw hardened. For the first time his anger was not aimed at Naomi. But pride, wounded pride, still fought for footing. "Even so," he said, looking back at her, "interrupting a sovereign close in front of the board was extraordinary." Naomi met him evenly. So was signing away reserve control without reading page 84. A sharp intake of breath moved around the table. It was not defiance for spectacle. It was moral clarity, and it cut deeper because it was calm. Whitmore held her gaze. Then something astonishing happened. He gave the faintest nod. Not agreement. Recognition. Yet before the room could settle into that fragile new equilibrium, Howard Finch cleared his throat. "There is another problem." He rotated a monitor toward them. A live commodities feed had updated while they argued. Copper futures were dropping fast. Currency pressure models flashed amber. The trigger Naomi warned about was no longer theoretical. It was beginning. Whitmore rose so abruptly his chair rolled back an inch. "Run the exposure cascade." Analysts moved at once. Screens flickered. Numbers populated. Naomi looked at the models and knew within seconds the losses could outrun the fund by dawn if counterparties reacted overnight. Whitmore turned toward her, no title in his voice now, only urgency. "Can it be contained?" Naomi looked at the descending red line, then at the man who had mocked her education less than an hour ago. Her answer came low and steady. "Only if we unwind the structure before Asia opens." And in the stunned stillness that followed, Richard Whitmore understood the room no longer revolved around his authority, but around whether Naomi Carter would choose to save it. No one questioned Naomi after that. The room had moved beyond skepticism into the sharper territory where consequence breathes down every second. Screens washed the boardroom in pale blue light as analysts worked in near silence, fingers moving over keyboards with the controlled urgency of people aware that mistakes now carried national-scale costs. Outside, the Hudson had become a sheet of black glass broken by fairy lights, and somewhere below, traffic hummed 27 floors down, indifferent to the tremor gathering above it. Richard Whitmore stood beside the central monitor while exposure models rolled across the screen. 28 billion in contingent liabilities. Sovereign reserves vulnerable to cascading calls by Tokyo Open. 92 minutes until Asian markets began reacting. Numbers did not panic, but people did. Naomi stepped toward the terminal and studied the structure in motion, seeing not columns and ratios but pressure lines, where fear would travel first. Where counterparties would pull liquidity, where one rumor could become self-fulfilling collapse. Freeze settlement authorization, she said. Suspend secondary confirmations and isolate the offshore custodian. No one objected. A half-hour earlier men in this room had questioned whether she belonged near the table. Now they were writing down her instructions. Martin Ellison turned. That could trigger litigation. Naomi did not look up. So will insolvency. Richard absorbed that in silence. Then he did something no one expected. He moved aside from the head of the table and gestured toward the primary seat. Take the chair. The word startled the room more than any revelation so far. It was not symbolic. It was surrender of command. Naomi looked at him, measuring whether pride was staging humility or whether something deeper had broken open. What she saw was not polished dominance but a man confronting limits. Slowly she sat. Leather creaked beneath her as she pulled the terminal closer. For an instant memory flashed again, another crisis room years before, another table full of men older than she was, all waiting for the youngest voice to make a call no one else dared make. She pushed the thought aside. We unwind through the reserve side letter, she said. Not the main facility. Howard Finch frowned. That instrument has not been activated in years. Naomi's eyes stayed on the screen. Exactly why they will not expect it. She began outlining a defensive unwind sequence in measured steps, each one stripping leverage from the trap without igniting market panic. The room listened. Even Whitmore took notes. Yet tension had not vanished. It had merely changed shape. At minute 43 into the emergency review, a compliance director entered carrying a folder marked archival credentials. He paused when he saw Naomi in the head chair. Sir, legal requested verification. He placed the folder beside Whitmore. Inside were records from the sovereign fund Naomi once ran, appointments, signatures, testimony transcripts before international committees. Proof beyond rumor. Whitmore opened one page and stopped. There was Naomi's signature authorizing the reserve. Defense credited with preventing a regional debt spiral. He looked at her, and shame flickered openly now. I mocked your education. It was almost spoken to himself. Naomi did not soften. You mocked what you assumed education looked like. That struck deeper because it was true. No one moved. Then alarms flashed amber across one of the monitors. Counterparty spreads were widening faster than projected. A junior analyst's voice shook. We may not make Asia open. The room contracted around the words. Whitmore turned instinctively toward Naomi, not as superior to subordinate, but as one human turns toward the person who might hold a way through. Naomi stared at the red spread widening across the screen. For the first time all night, even she felt the edge of uncertainty. Then she noticed something buried in the settlement waterfall. A dormant sovereign backstop clause no one had modeled. Her hand froze over the keyboard. Her breathing slowed. Do not touch anything, she said. I just found the door they thought no one would see. And every eye in the room lifted toward her as if history itself had leaned forward. Naomi did not move for several seconds. Her eyes remained fixed on the dormant clause buried 3 layers beneath the settlement waterfall, a provision written in language so obscure it had disguised itself as procedural debris. But she knew better. The most dangerous instruments often hid behind ordinary words. Around her the room had gone nearly sacred in its stillness, the kind that arrives when people sense they are standing beside a precipice and someone has just pointed to a narrow ledge. The amber warning lights reflected in the glass walls, pulsing faintly across faces that hours earlier carried confidence and condescension. Now those same faces waited. Naomi leaned closer to the screen. This backstop clause routes through a dormant bilateral guarantee tied to emergency commodity reserves, she said, voice low, almost reverent. If we trigger it before counterparties call exposure, we force settlement through sovereign collateral protections they cannot unwind overnight. Martin Ellison stared as though hearing a forgotten language return. That provision was shelved after the commodity crisis. Naomi gave the slightest nod. Shelved does not mean dead. Richard Whitmore stepped nearer but did not interrupt. He seemed almost afraid sound itself could disturb the fragile path she was tracing. Naomi's fingers moved over the keyboard, pulling archived reserve protocols into view. Old legal architecture unfolded across the monitors like maps from another era. She felt the room recede. For a moment there was only pattern, pressure, memory. She remembered sitting once in a government annex lit by generator power during rolling blackouts, drafting emergency liquidity bridges while exhausted ministers argued over wheat imports. Her mentor had told her then, in every collapse there is one hidden hinge. Find it before panic does. She had never forgotten. We can pivot through the guarantee, she said, but only if Whitmore Capital waives fee priority and takes secondary recovery position. The room reacted at once. That was no technical adjustment. It meant Richard Whitmore personally accepting diminished profit to protect the sovereign fund. A younger version of him might have rejected it on instinct. Tonight he did not even hesitate. Do it. The answer came so quickly several executives looked up in surprise. Naomi turned toward him, studying him anew. There was no performance in his face now, no billionaire's cultivated certainty, only a stripped-down seriousness that looked almost human in its vulnerability. You understand what you are conceding, she said. Whitmore met her eyes. I understand what arrogance almost cost. The words settled deep. Even Naomi felt something in herself loosen, though she kept her focus on the terminal. She entered the backstop sequence. The system processed. Seconds dragged. Somewhere in the room a heating vent clicked. Someone exhaled too loudly. Then the spread monitor paused. Red indicators flickered, then narrowed. One by one amber warnings shifted toward neutral. The junior analyst nearest the market feed whispered, hardly believing it, pressure is easing. No one celebrated. Relief came too cautiously for that. But shoulders lowered. Breath returned. Whitmore rested one hand against the chair Naomi had taken, as though grounding himself. He looked at her not with gratitude alone but with something bordering on humility. You saved the fund. Naomi shook her head once. The clause was always there. I only refused to ignore it. Her words carried the moral weight of everything that had passed between them. Yet even as calm began returning, a soft chime sounded from the archived credential folder still open beside Whitmore. An old article had surfaced linked to Naomi's sovereign record. The headline glowed across the tablet. Architect of the Reserve Rescue resigned after refusing political pressure. Whitmore read it and frowned. You resigned. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A shadow crossed it. I was pushed out, she said. Silence followed, heavier than before. Because now the room understood not only that she had once held power, but that power had discarded her. Whitmore looked stricken by the shape of that injustice. Before he could speak, Tokyo Futures opened on the side monitor. Prices stabilized. The trap had been broken. A quiet unlike any earlier silence filled the boardroom, not tension now but the hush after a storm passes. Naomi leaned back at last, exhaustion touching her features. And in that rare stillness, under city lights reflected like stars in the glass, Richard Whitmore realized the woman he had mocked had not simply rescued his fortune. She had revealed the poverty in his own understanding. Tokyo Futures held steady through the next 12 minutes, and with every unchanged tick the room seemed to relearn how to breathe. Analysts began speaking in lower voices again. Someone finally sipped the water untouched for hours. The city beyond the windows shimmered in midnight blue, each office tower now less like a fortress and more like distant lanterns suspended over the river. Naomi sat back from the terminal, shoulders carrying the fatigue she had kept hidden beneath discipline. For the first time all evening she looked less like an emergency architect and more like a woman who had spent years carrying silence heavier than recognition. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside her chair, but the old geometry of power between them had dissolved. He was not looming now. He was waiting. It was a posture few in the room had likely ever seen him take. Martin Ellison closed the legal binders and spoke first. The sovereign fund is protected. The sentence was simple, almost clinical, yet it landed with the gravity of absolution. A few people nodded in quiet disbelief. Howard Finch removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose as though embarrassed by how near disaster had come under his watch. Then Whitmore did something that caused every head in the room to lift again. He stepped to the head of the table, where his chair still sat empty, and did not reclaim it. Instead he faced the board. "Before we adjourn," he said, voice steady but altered, "there is something I need corrected in the record." The room went still. Naomi looked up slowly. Whitmore's gaze moved once toward her, then back to the others. "Tonight I dismissed expertise because it arrived in a form my arrogance did not recognize." No one shifted. No one dared. "Ms. Carter warned this board before I listened. She protected this fund when my own judgment nearly exposed it." He paused, and in that pause there was no theatrical remorse, only a man forcing truth through pride. "I was wrong." The words, so ordinary in themselves, carried extraordinary weight coming from him. Naomi felt the room absorb them almost physically. Men who had spent careers watching Whitmore dominate negotiations were witnessing something rarer than victory. Contrition. But he was not finished. He turned fully toward her. "And I owe you an apology." There it was, plain and unshielded. Naomi held his gaze. She could have made the moment sting. Could have returned humiliation with humiliation. Yet the years had taught her something power never fully learns. Dignity does not need revenge to prove itself. "What matters," she said quietly, "is whether you see differently tomorrow than you did this morning." The sentence moved through the room like a soft verdict. Whitmore gave the faintest nod, but his eyes betrayed something deeper unsettled in him. Shame, yes. But also awakening. Then he reached into the archival folder and drew out the old Geneva photograph. He looked at it once more before setting it before her. "You should never have had to return hidden." Naomi's expression changed, touched by something almost sorrowful. "Many people return hidden." The line struck harder than accusation because it widened beyond them both. It implicated systems. Rooms. Histories. Even Whitmore seemed to feel it. He looked toward the skyline as if seeing the city's architecture with altered meaning. Then, after a silence long enough to settle into memory, he asked, "What would it take for you to come back?" Some around the table stirred, realizing the question carried more than consultancy. It sounded like invitation into power itself. Naomi looked down at the photograph, at the younger self she had spent years trying not to revisit. She thought of the doors closed after refusing political pressure, of expertise dismissed until crisis made it necessary again. She could have answered with ambition. Instead she said, it would take knowing the table changed, not just who sits at it. No one spoke. Even Whitmore had no immediate reply. Because the challenge was moral, not transactional. And it lingered heavier than any financial risk discussed that night. Then Whitmore did one final thing no one anticipated. He pulled the chair at the head of the table back and left it empty. "Then perhaps," he said, almost to himself, "that begins tonight." And as Naomi looked at the vacant chair under Silver City light, she understood the deeper reversal had never been about a billionaire learning who she once was. It was about a powerful man beginning, painfully, to see who he had been. No one left the boardroom for several minutes after Whitmore's words. It was as if the empty chair at the head of the table had become its own quiet witness, holding more weight than any person in it. Midnight deepened beyond the glass walls, and rain began tracing faint silver lines down the windows, soft and almost invisible unless the city lights caught it. Naomi gathered her folders slowly, the same folders she had carried in as temporary support, though now they seemed to belong to a different life than the one she had entered with. Around the table executives moved with unusual restraint, voices lowered as though loud speech might fracture what had just been restored. Martin Ellison approached first. He held out a revised authorization packet, fresh pages clipped over the old failed structure. "We have redrafted the facility unwind under your sequence," he said. Then after a pause, with something close to reverence, "Would you review before we execute?" Naomi took the packet, studied the revisions, and marked 2 quiet corrections with a fountain pen someone had left near her seat. Even now precision mattered. Whitmore watched her write as if watching a craft he had once mistaken for luck. When she returned the packet, he did not reach for it immediately. "Stay," he said. The word carried no command. Only appeal. Naomi looked toward the windows where rain shimmered over the Hudson. "I came to stop a bad signature," she said. "That has been done." Whitmore stepped closer, careful as though nearing something fragile. "I offered you a seat at the table." Naomi gave a faint almost smile. "You offered me a seat in the structure that once pushed me out." The truth of it landed, but not cruelly. Whitmore absorbed it without defense. That alone revealed how much had changed. Then something shifted in him again. He reached into his jacket and removed a cream business card embossed in understated silver. It was not the kind distributed casually. It carried only a name, direct line, and the private office of Whitmore Capital's governing trust. He placed it beside her folders. "Not an offer of employment," he said. "An invitation to redesign the Sovereign Ethics Desk from the ground up. Independent authority. Your terms." Several board members looked stunned. Whitmore was not known for surrendering structural control. Naomi did not touch the card. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Whitmore's answer came almost softly. "Then I will still owe tonight to you." The room held that sentence in silence. Naomi looked at the card, then at the empty head chair. For years she had imagined vindication as return to status, some grand correction of what had been taken. Yet standing here, she felt a stranger truth. Vindication was not re-entering power unchanged. It was being free enough to choose differently. She picked up the card, turned it once between her fingers, then placed it back on the table. Gasps were almost audible. Whitmore did not hide his surprise. "No?" he asked. Naomi shook her head gently. "Not tonight." She gathered her folders and began walking toward the door. Her heels moved softly over carpet, each step measured, almost ceremonial. But just before reaching the threshold she stopped. Without turning she said, "Rebuild the table first." Then she left. The door closed with a muted click that sounded louder than any applause might have. No one spoke. Whitmore remained where she had left him, staring at the untouched card. Rain threaded the glass. Minutes passed. Then Martin Ellison said quietly, "She turned down Whitmore Capital." Whitmore gave a faint breath that might have been wonder. "No," he said. "She turned down being used to decorate what she asked us to change." And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore sat not at the head of the table but in the chair Naomi had occupied, looking at models still glowing on the screen she had steadied. Dawn began edging pale blue along the river. In that fragile hour between night and market open, he made a call to suspend the old sovereign desk entirely. Not because crisis required it. Because conscience now did. And somewhere in the elevator descending through sleeping floors, Naomi Carter stood alone beneath soft brass light, hearing only the hum of cables and her own breathing, carrying with her the quiet power of having walked away when lesser victories might have tempted her to stay. Dawn arrived almost without announcement. The rain had thinned to mist, soft against the tower glass, and the first pale wash of morning moved over the Hudson in silver ribbons. In the boardroom the screen still glowed, but dimmer now against natural light, their urgency faded into quiet numbers resting after a storm. Richard Whitmore stood alone near the window where he had once looked down on the city as though certainty belonged to height. Now his reflection in the glass seemed less fixed, layered with the waking skyline and the faint tracks rain had left behind. On the walnut table the empty chair remained turned slightly outward, untouched since Naomi had risen from it. No one had moved it back. There was something almost ceremonial in that. The revised sovereign structure lay signed beside cooling coffee no one remembered pouring. Near it rested the cream card Naomi had left behind. Whitmore reached toward it once, then let his hand fall. In the hush he could still hear the cadence of her words, not as accusation now but as measure. Rebuild the table first. The sentence lingered in him with the persistence of conscience. He sat slowly in the chair she had occupied and looked at the screens where her sequence still held the fun steady through Asian Open. For years he had believed power meant never being corrected in public. Yet what remained after the night's unraveling was not humiliation but an unfamiliar relief, as though some harder armor had cracked and air had reached a place long sealed. Across the room Martin Ellison gathered folders without speaking, his movements almost reverent, paper sliding softly, binder rings clicking shut. No one rushed to leave. The urgency had passed, but departure seemed too abrupt for what the room had witnessed. Down in the lobby Naomi crossed marble floors washed in early blue light. The overnight security guard, who had barely looked up when she arrived, now rose and held the door for her without a word. Outside, the morning air carried the cool clean scent after rain. Taxi tires hissed over wet pavement. Steam drifted from a street grate in slow white ribbons. Naomi paused beneath the awning, folders held against her coat, and looked toward the river where the first sun touched water. There was no triumph in her face. Only stillness. The kind earned, not performed. She thought of old ministries, dismissed years, closed doors, and strangely none of it pressed as heavily now. Some wounds do not vanish. They quiet. A black town car rolled past and vanished into traffic. A cyclist cut through a pool of gold light at the corner. Ordinary morning resumed around her, indifferent and beautiful. High above, Whitmore remained by the glass as sunlight reached the boardroom and moved across the table until it touched the empty chair. He watched the light rest there, then spread over the unsigned invitation card, and something in him settled into decision beyond markets or reputation. He picked up a pen and wrote a single note to the board secretary. Independent Ethics Review. Immediate. Then he placed the note beneath Naomi's marked corrections and left it there. No speech. No declaration. Only ink drying in silence. Outside, Naomi began walking south along the river path, heels soft against damp stone, her reflection appearing and disappearing in shallow rainwater gathered between pavement seams. Wind lifted a loose strand of hair across her cheek. She did not brush it away. The city moved around her, ferries sounding low in the distance, gulls wheeling above the water, sunlight widening. Behind her the tower caught morning and flashed briefly like polished fire. Ahead there was only the path, the breath of cold air, and the quiet rhythm of footsteps continuing. And in that unspoken movement, where no one bowed and no one conquered, justice remained not as spectacle but as something gentler, almost invisible, like light finding glass after rain.